History is filled with claims that continue to puzzle experts for years after they're first made. But among them, one claim made by a decorated government physicist about a remote Utah cattle ranch stands out above the rest. He says his team recorded radiation spikes so severe they had to evacuate. He says he heard a voice in his trailer telling him to check footage he hadn't yet seen. And when he finally watched it, he says, it showed him something he still cannot explain. What actually happened to Dr. Travis Taylor at Skinwalker Ranch, and why has he continued years later to stand by an account this strange? Before we go further, it's important to be precise about what this film is and what it isn't. This is a documentary about a real scientist, a real property, and claims he has made on the record, in his own words, across multiple public interviews. Everything you're about to hear regarding his professional background, his government career, and the existence of a real federal research program into unidentified aerial phenomena is independently documented. But the specific incident at the center of this story, the gamma ray readings, the voice, the footage, comes to us as personal testimony from Taylor himself and his production team. It has not been independently verified by outside scientists, and no peer-reviewed study confirms any paranormal or otherwise anomalous explanation for it. We will be careful throughout to keep that distinction clear. This is the story of a 512-acre ranch in Utah's Uinta Basin, a Pentagon program most Americans didn't know existed until recently. And the night a career defense scientist says something happened that he still hasn't been able to file away as either fully explained or fully understood. To understand why Taylor's account carries any particular weight, we first need to understand who he is, because his background is unusual, and it's the reason this claim gets taken seriously at all in scientific and government circles, rather than dismissed outright. Travis Shane Taylor was born in July of 1968 in Decatur, Alabama, the son of a machinist who had worked on some of America's earliest NASA satellite programs in Huntsville. As a teenager, Taylor built a working radio telescope in his backyard, sensitive enough to detect radio emissions from supernova remnants, a project that won a statewide science competition and caught the attention of the United States Army, which funded his engineering education at Auburn University in exchange for cooperative work at Redstone Arsenal on directed energy weapons research. From there, Taylor built one of the more academically dense resumes in American aerospace, eventually earning 5 advanced degrees, a master's in physics, a doctorate in optical science and engineering, a master's in mechanical and aerospace engineering, a doctorate in aerospace systems engineering, and a master's in astronomy, while working for more than 3 decades across NASA and the United States Department of Defense, much of it with the Army's Space and Missile Defense Command. His documented research areas include advanced space propulsion, large space telescopes, directed energy and laser systems, and modeling work tied to missile defense. Taylor has said publicly that many specifics of that work remain classified even now. Outside his defense career, he built a second public identity as a science fiction novelist and television personality before, in 2019, taking on a role that would connect his classified government work directly to Skinwalker Ranch. Around that time, according to Taylor's own account, in an interview with journalist George Knapp, he grew concerned that some of what his ranch investigation team was recording might touch on genuine national security matters. He requested a meeting with Pentagon contacts to share what he'd found, and after his security clearances were verified, he was invited to join a newly forming task force as its chief scientist. That task force, the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, was formally backed by Congress, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and the Secretary of Defense, and was charged with reviewing more than 140 documented military encounters with unexplained aerial objects. Taylor held that role from 2019 until his retirement from full-time federal service around 2022, after which he joined a private defense contracting firm. That background is the reason his account of what happened at the ranch is treated differently than the ranch's older folklore. Taylor isn't a rancher recounting a family legend passed down over decades. He's a man with above top secret government clearance, a career spent evaluating exactly this kind of sensor data professionally, and by his own repeated admission, no obvious incentive to damage his own scientific credibility on national television. Now let's establish the ranch itself, because the land's history matters for understanding why anyone was recording anything there in the first place. The property sits near the small town of Ballard in Utah's Uinta Basin, close to the Uinta and Ouray Reservation. In the early 1990s, the Sherman family purchased the ranch and began reporting a range of unexplained occurrences, cattle mutilations, unusual lights, encounters they said they could not otherwise explain. It's worth noting, and skeptics have been careful to point this out, that the family who owned this same land for the 60 years before the Shermans arrived reported nothing unusual during their entire tenure, a detail that continues to inform how cautiously serious researchers approach the ranch's earliest claims. In 1996, the Shermans sold the property to Robert Bigelow, a Las Vegas aerospace and real estate billionaire who had already founded a private institute dedicated to investigating unexplained phenomena. Bigelow gave the ranch the name it carries today, drawn from a concept in Navajo folklore describing a malevolent shapeshifter, though it's worth being precise that this name was assigned by Bigelow himself in the 1990s, not a name the land carried among local tribes for generations. Bigelow's team spent roughly a decade quietly monitoring the property, and their full findings were never made public. In 2005, journalist George Knapp and researcher Colm Kelleher published a book examining the ranch's history, becoming a national bestseller and bringing the property to wide public attention for the first time. According to multiple journalistic accounts, a Defense Intelligence Agency official later read that book, visited the ranch personally, and relayed his own account back to Bigelow. A chain of contacts reported to have helped lead toward a broader, Pentagon-funded research effort into unidentified aerial phenomena, an effort that received real congressional backing, championed in part by then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and later confirmed through Department of Defense disclosures and extensive investigative reporting, including a widely cited 2021 piece in The New Yorker. In 2016, Bigelow sold the ranch to Brandon Fugel, a Utah commercial real estate chairman who initially purchased it through a shell company to keep his ownership private. In 2020, the History Channel began airing a documentary series following a new team of investigators on the property, a team that came to include Travis Taylor as lead scientist, alongside principal investigator Eric Bard, security lead Bryant Arnold, and ranch superintendent Thomas Winterton. Now to the specific claim at the center of this story, laid out as precisely as the available sourcing allows. In interviews given ahead of the show's fourth season, which premiered in April, Taylor described a pattern his team had begun recording using calibrated scientific instruments, not conventional Geiger counters or consumer equipment, but instruments specifically designed to measure the spectrum of gamma radiation. According to Taylor, his team recorded spikes at a very particular reading, 511 kilo electron volts, a number that he has noted corresponds to the specific energy signature released when matter and antimatter annihilate one another. Taylor has said that on several occasions, radiation levels at certain points on the property climbed high enough that the team had to evacuate the area entirely for safety reasons. Taylor has been careful, in his own words, to frame this as a genuine open question rather than a confirmed paranormal event. He has said publicly that what his team is measuring may represent, in his words, an entirely new regime of science and technology, something beyond the physics he understands, while also acknowledging plainly that he does not yet have a testable hypothesis for what's causing it. He has pushed back specifically against the idea that the investigation is simply television spectacle, insisting in interviews that the instrumentation used, infrared, radar, calibrated radiation detectors, is the same caliber of equipment used in serious defense and aerospace research, not props. But the specific incident that anchors this story is more personal and stranger than an instrument reading. According to Taylor's own account, given in a podcast interview, one night after a team experiment the previous summer, he went to bed in his trailer on the property and heard what he described as a booming voice. Taylor has said he could not be certain whether he was fully awake or somewhere between waking and sleep, but the voice in his account told him directly to check the GoPro footage. Taylor says that afterward, he located and reviewed footage recorded from a helicopter during an earlier experiment, and that what he saw in that footage was, in his own description, amazing, fantastic, and something he did not expect to find. Taylor has not, in the material publicly available, offered a frame-by-frame description of exactly what the footage showed, beyond characterizing it as something viewers would find hard to believe once it aired. It's worth being direct here about the limits of independent verification. This account rests entirely on Taylor's own retelling, given in interview settings connected to promoting the television series, without an independent, outside chain of custody for the raw footage that has been reviewed by scientists unconnected to the production. That doesn't make the claim untrue, but responsible reporting on it requires saying clearly that, unlike his employment history and academic credentials, this specific story has not been corroborated by any source outside Taylor and the production team he works with. It's also worth setting this claim beside some of the broader, previously reported incidents on the ranch, because it fits a pattern the investigation has documented across several seasons. During earlier filming, the team reportedly captured high-speed camera footage of a rocket exploding mid-air near a location on the property nicknamed the Triangle, footage that Taylor and the team have said showed a symmetrical, cloud-like anomaly at the moment of the explosion. In a separate experiment, the team used a helicopter to drop canisters fitted with GPS trackers, and reported that several canisters appeared to be deflected mid-fall in ways inconsistent with wind alone. In another documented instance, the team aimed a laser beam directly upward toward the same airspace and recorded what principal investigator Eric Bard described on camera as an orb-like object ascending alongside the beam. Each of these accounts comes from the production and its named investigators, reported consistently across multiple seasons, but none has been independently replicated or confirmed by scientists outside the show. Skeptical voices have remained active throughout this entire period. Science writer Robert Sheffer has pointed out that the earliest paranormal claims at the ranch emerged specifically around the time the Sherman family was preparing to sell the property, a timeline he argues deserves real scrutiny before accepting later claims at face value. Historian and folklore scholar Greg Egidian has separately observed that it remains difficult to be anything but skeptical of the ranch's paranormal claims generally, given that they've largely been advanced by people already personally invested in supernatural explanations, without the kind of sustained, independent academic study that would normally be expected before extraordinary claims are accepted. It's also fair, in the interest of balance, to note the argument made by people who take Taylor's account seriously specifically because of who he is. A career spent evaluating classified sensor data for the United States government is not, by itself, proof that any particular claim is true. But it is a meaningfully different starting point than an uncredentialed witness recounting an unverifiable personal experience. And it's the reason mainstream outlets and even the journal Science have found Taylor's dual role, chief government UAP scientist and on-camera ranch investigator, worth covering as a serious story in its own right, rather than dismissing it outright. That same 2022 Science piece did note that SETI Institute astronomer Seth Shostak expressed skepticism about placing someone with Taylor's television credits in such a prominent federal science role, a tension that remains part of how his claims are received by parts of the scientific community. So where does this leave us with the specific claim that anchors this story? The gamma ray spikes, the evacuations, the voice, the footage, Taylor says he still can't fully explain. Here is what we can say is documented. The instruments used to record gamma radiation on the ranch are real, calibrated scientific equipment consistent with Taylor's professional background. The broader Pentagon interest in unidentified aerial phenomena and its real congressional funding is independently confirmed well beyond anything connected to this single ranch or this single scientist. Taylor's professional credentials, his security clearance, and his role leading the government's UAP task force are all independently documented facts, not claims resting on his own word alone. Here is what remains honestly unverified. The specific radiation readings, the content of the disputed footage, and the account of the voice in his trailer all rest on testimony from Taylor and his production team without independent outside confirmation. That doesn't mean the account is false. It means it occupies the same category as most of what makes Skinwalker Ranch compelling in the first place. A claim made by someone with real, hard-won scientific credibility about an experience that so far exists outside the reach of independent scientific verification. What we can say with confidence, without overstating anything, is this. A man with above top secret government clearance, 3.5 decades of classified defense and aerospace work, and a professional reputation he has spent his entire adult life building, has chosen repeatedly, in his own words, across multiple public interviews, to describe an experience on this ranch he says he still cannot explain using the physics he understands. He has not walked the claim back. He has not attributed it to a simple mistake or a trick of the desert light. He has instead continued to describe it as an open scientific question, one he says deserves serious study rather than dismissal, while being candid that he doesn't yet have a hypothesis that can actually be tested. Whatever ultimately explains the radiation spikes, the voice and the footage Travis Taylor says he found waiting for him on a helicopter camera. One thing about this story is certain. It did not originate with an anonymous witness, a grainy home video, or a secondhand family legend passed down for generations. It came from a credentialed government physicist describing in his own words something he says happened to him personally on a piece of land that has spent 30 years accumulating exactly this kind of account, and never once fully resolving any of them. It's worth stepping back before we close to place this single claim inside the much larger story of how seriously the United States government has come to treat unidentified aerial phenomena in recent years, because that broader context is what separates Skinwalker Ranch from countless other unverified paranormal hotspots scattered across the country. For most of the 20th century, U.S. government engagement with reports of unidentified flying objects moved in fits and starts. The Air Force ran a public investigative program from the late 1940s into the early 1970s, ultimately concluding that the vast majority of sightings had conventional explanations, and the program was formally closed. For decades afterward, government interest in the subject, if it existed at all, remained largely unacknowledged. That changed meaningfully starting around 2017, when reporting revealed the existence of a Pentagon program that had, years earlier, studied reports of unidentified aerial phenomena encountered by military personnel, funded through Defense Department appropriations, backed by then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. That revelation triggered a cascade of further disclosures, the release of infrared video recorded by Navy pilots, congressional hearings, and eventually the formal creation of the task force Taylor would go on to lead, followed by a permanent office within the Department of Defense tasked with continuing that work. None of this history is unique to Skinwalker Ranch, and none of it by itself confirms anything about the specific claims made on that property. But it does explain why a credentialed government scientist investigating a Utah cattle ranch on cable television isn't quite as strange a juxtaposition as it might first appear. By the time Taylor joined the ranch investigation, the U.S. government itself had already begun treating unidentified aerial phenomena as a legitimate subject of formal study, rather than dismissing the entire category outright. It's also worth placing Skinwalker Ranch beside other well-known American sites associated with unexplained phenomena, because the comparison highlights what actually makes this particular property unusual. Places like Roswell, New Mexico, or various stretches of desert associated with decades-old UFO sightings tend to rest almost entirely on historical testimony, decades-old witness account, and secondhand reporting, with little to no ongoing, instrumented scientific investigation. Skinwalker Ranch is different in one specific, verifiable respect. It has had, across nearly 3 decades now, a continuous chain of private-funded investigation, first through Bigelow's Institute, then through Fugel's ownership and the television production, using real scientific instrumentation and, at times, direct connections to federal researchers. That doesn't make the ranch's claims true, but it does mean the ranch occupies a different evidentiary category than most sites associated with American UFO folklore, simply because of how much of its investigative history is documented in real time, rather than reconstructed decades later from fading memory. The television series itself deserves some context too, since it's the vehicle through which nearly all of Taylor's specific claims, including the gamma ray readings and the GoPro footage story, have reached the public. The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch premiered in 2020 and quickly became one of the History Channel's highest-rated original series, expanding across multiple seasons and eventually spawning a companion after-show format, allowing the investigators to discuss developments directly with the audience. The show's structure, following a team of named, credentialed investigators using visible scientific equipment, distinguishes it from more purely speculative paranormal programming, and it's part of why outlets well outside the paranormal media space, including general entertainment press and, at times, mainstream science journalism, have covered it as a subject in its own right, rather than ignoring it entirely. That mainstream attention has cut both ways for Taylor personally. On one hand, his presence has lent the production a level of institutional credibility it likely wouldn't have had otherwise, given his documented background evaluating exactly the kind of sensor and radar data the show relies on. On the other hand, that same visibility invited direct scrutiny of his simultaneous roles, culminating in the 2022 Science Journal piece questioning whether a chief government UAP scientist should also be starring in speculative television programming. Taylor's defenders have argued consistently that his government analysis and his television work rely on different standards of evidence and disclosure, by necessity, given classification requirements, and that the two roles shouldn't be treated as interchangeable simply because they overlap in subject matter. His critics counter that appearing across a range of programming, exploring ancient astronaut theories and other speculative topics, in addition to Skinwalker Ranch, complicates the public's ability to distinguish his rigorous government work from his more speculative on-camera role. That tension is, in many ways, the honest center of this entire story. Taylor is neither a fringe figure with no scientific standing, nor an infallible authority whose personal testimony should be treated as settled fact simply because of his resume. He is a genuinely credentialed scientist, choosing repeatedly and by his own account to describe experiences he says defy his own extensive training, on a property with a 30-year history of producing exactly that reaction in the people who spend enough time there. None of this resolves the specific question raised by that night in his trailer, the voice and the footage that followed. It's entirely possible that a fuller, more mundane explanation exists: equipment malfunction, an unusual but ultimately conventional aircraft, an artifact of night vision or infrared imaging that produced a startling but explainable result. It's also possible, as Taylor himself has framed it, that his team recorded something genuinely outside current scientific understanding. Responsible reporting on this story means holding both possibilities open simultaneously, rather than collapsing the story into either easy skepticism or easy belief. What can be said, in closing, is narrower and more solid than any conclusion about the paranormal. A scientist with 3.5 decades of classified defense and aerospace experience, who spent years evaluating exactly this category of sensor and instrument data for the United States government, chose to describe on the record and under his own name an experience he says he still cannot fully explain. He did so knowing it would be scrutinized by peers, by journalists, and by a national television audience, and he has not, in the years since, walked the account back or reframed it as simple showmanship. Whatever ultimately explains the radiation spikes, the voice, and the footage Travis Taylor says he found waiting for him on a helicopter camera, one thing about this story is certain. It did not originate with an anonymous witness, a grainy home video, or a secondhand family legend passed down for generations. It came from a credentialed government physicist describing, in his own words, something he says happened to him personally on a piece of land that has spent 30 years accumulating exactly this kind of and never once fully resolving any of them. The search Taylor began on that ranch, honestly reported, openly contested, and still without a testable answer, continues. And so for now, does the question that opened this film, what really happened, and why has a man with everything to lose professionally continued to stand behind an account this strange? Perhaps the most useful way to hold this story is not as a verdict, but as an open case file, the kind Taylor himself would recognize from decades spent evaluating incomplete, ambiguous defense data long before he ever set foot on that ranch. Some readings get explained, some get quietly reclassified as censor error, and some sit for years in a folder marked unresolved, not because no one is looking, but because the evidence available simply hasn't crossed the threshold that separates a compelling account from a confirmed one. By his own repeated admission, that's exactly where this claim still sits. Not proven, not debunked, simply unresolved, in the hands of one of the more credentialed people ever to describe it publicly, and still waiting, years later, for an answer neither he nor anyone else has yet been able to supply.